This morning's gospel story is about darkness. Now, before we get into it, this is a difficult and complicated piece of scripture. But you know what? This has been a difficult year. It's been a complicated week. And so why not add our gospel to that list as well? I shared with you last week a story about Mother Teresa. Some of you may remember that she passed away in 1997. Not long after her death, a collection of her letters was published in a book titled, "Come, Be My Light." Several of these reflections were written to her spiritual advisors and had never been made public before. The most shocking revelation for many people was that for nearly the last 50 years of her life, Mother Teresa struggled to feel connected with God. She recounts a deep, abiding spiritual pain that left her feeling doubtful and uncertain. At one point, she describes her soul as being an ice block. She writes to one of her spiritual advisors, "Tell me, why is there so much pain and uncertainty in my soul?" This experience is often referred to as the dark night of the soul. And Mother Teresa is not the only notable Christian to write about it. Her story is echoed by people like John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, among others. Similar phenomenon has also been documented from the perspective of Buddhism, Judaism, Sufism, which makes it clear to me that darkness, doubt, and uncertainty touch many of our lives in some form or another. Turning to our gospel, the section from Matthew is all about the end of time. The disciples ask when the end will come, and so Jesus tells them what signs to look for. He sprinkles in some parables like this as well. And you know, I think many of us have been conditioned by a certain type of Christianity to imagine the end of time as involving God on the throne, or Jesus on a horse. They're judging us, sending some to heaven, others to hell. A lot of people think that's what this church stuff is all about, heaven and hell. But that's not what we find this morning. Instead, Jesus tells a parable about a wedding. Here are the two details that help me unpack the story. The first is when the groom arrives at midnight, at the darkest hour, when no one is expecting it. We do not wait alone in the darkness, Jesus seems to be saying. God meets us there. I find that so powerful. And then the second place I'll draw your attention is this disagreement between bridesmaids. Some of their lamps are out of oil, and when they ask the others for help, they're scolded. It's easy to interpret this as, you weren't prepared, so pay the consequences. You reap what you sow. And again, a certain type of Christianity loves to emphasize that. If you're not living the right way, believing the right way, whatever that means, then you'll be quote-unquote left behind. It's going to be your own fault. But I tend to think there's another dimension to what Jesus is saying. Remember, he's always encouraging us to explore the deeper questions. So for me, the message here is less about, quote-unquote, being prepared, and more about doing the work for yourself. What I mean by that is, when you find yourself in the dark, and we will all stand there at some point in our lives, when you're wrestling with doubt and uncertainty, when you're standing at a crossroads and you're unsure of which direction you should go, no one else can take that next step for you. A wise mentor once said, no one can do your homework for you. I'd add to that, no one can think for you, no one can experience for you. In the lingo of this parable, no one can turn on the light and make the darkness disappear for you. Does that make sense? It's so important for us to delve into these parables. This is the way Jesus teaches, right? Through parables. And so if we just kind of blow them off or rush past them, or even if we accept whatever we were taught about them 20 years ago without doing our own critical thinking, then we run the risk of missing the deeper lesson. There's always more to these parables than meets the eye. But even beyond all of this, Jesus' parables still hold up. 2,000 years later, in the midst of a pandemic and an election, the wisdom of these parables still guides us and teaches us. I'm not going to pretend to know what your experience of this past week has been. I do know that we live here on Capitol Hill and that many of our lives intersect with the government in some way or another. I know that we range from Democrat to Republican to independent to unaffiliated. Some of us are hyper-political, others are apolitical. This is one of the things that I love about our Christ Church community. And yet, no matter where you find yourself on the spectrum, if you walked down Pennsylvania Avenue or Barracks Road earlier this week, right here in our neighborhood, you noticed that there were restaurants boarded up in anticipation of violence. The feeling was precarious. In many ways, it still is. But then, of course, even though this week represented an apex of sorts, 2020 has been a year in which apprehension has run deep. We're still waiting for a vaccine that will be here in January, or April, or next July. Our kids have been encouraged to go to school, while parents have been pressured to keep them at home. Seemingly each week we mourn yet another killing of one of our black brothers or sisters. The Gulf Coast has been slammed by hurricanes. Our western states are literally on fire. If you're paying attention at all, there's a sense of what's going to happen next. While I desperately wish I knew the answer to that question, the only assurance I can offer this morning is that God will meet us there and will help us take that next step. Barbara Brown Taylor says that darkness is shorthand for anything that scares us, anything that we won't know part of, either because we're unsure whether or not we have the resources to survive it, or because we don't want to find out. None of us want to stand in this territory. No one enjoys feeling anxious or uncertain or out of control, and yet great wisdom seekers from many traditions teach us that there are things we learn in the dark that we could never be taught in the light. I want to close with a prayer that we read during morning prayer this past Wednesday. It's entitled Prayer for People Facing Great Uncertainty. It's from a New Zealand prayer book. It reads like this. God of the present moment, God who in Jesus stills the storm and soothes the frantic heart, bring hope and courage to all who wait or work in uncertainty. Bring hope that you will make them the equal of whatever lies ahead. Bring them courage to endure what can't be avoided. For your will is health and wholeness. You are God, and we need you. In the name of God.